The desperate journey. The sky over the ashen expanse had not known mercy in 3 seasons. What had once been rolling valleys of tall amber grass was now a brittle graveyard of cracked earth and skeletal trees. Rivers that once shimmered like ribbons of silver had shrunk into narrow veins of mud, and the wind carried nothing but dust and the faint scent of distant smoke. High above that dying land, Lysera of the Emerald Cliffs struggled to keep her wings steady. She had once flown effortlessly across mountain ranges, her scales flashing green and gold beneath the sun, her shadow sweeping across forests like a blessing. Now each beat of her wings felt heavier than iron, hunger gnawed at her muscles, exhaustion dulled her reflexes. But she did not slow. Cradled in her forelegs was a small, fragile form wrapped in the curve of her body. Her son. Arian's silver scales should have gleamed like moonlight on water. Instead, they were dull and brittle at the edges. His tiny claws, once sharp and restless, now hung limp against her chest. His breathing came in faint, shallow pulls, barely stirring the air between them. Every few moments, Lysera tilted her head downward to listen. Still breathing. Still alive. The faint glow beneath Arian's sternum flickered uncertainly. Every dragon was born with heartfire, a small ember of living flame that powered their strength, regulated their immense bodies, and bound them to the ancient magic of the world. In a healthy hatchling, that glow pulsed bright and steady. In Arian, it sputtered like a candle drowning in wax. Lysera pressed him closer against her chest, willing her own warmth to flow into him. "Stay with me, little flame," she murmured in the ancient tongue of her kind. "Stay." Below her, the land stretched endlessly toward the human territories. Toward hope. Or ruins. 3 nights earlier, she had stood within the circle of elders. The emerald cliffs rose like jagged crowns from the earth, their peaks wrapped in clouds and legend. Dragons of every hue and age had once nested there in abundance. Now the ledges were sparse. Many had flown east in search of richer hunting grounds. Some had not returned. Lysera had remained. Arian had hatched at the beginning of the drought when prey had already begun thinning. She had hunted relentlessly, scouring valleys and forests for even the smallest herd. She had eaten sparingly, giving the best portions to her son. But something had been wrong from the beginning. Arian had never burned as brightly as the others. His heartfire had flickered even when his stomach was full. She had brought him before the elders when his wings grew too weak to hold himself upright. The oldest among them, Vareth, whose scales had faded to pale stone with age, had lowered his massive head and studied the hatchling in silence. The cavern had been still except for the distant whistle of wind through stone. "It is not only hunger," Vareth had finally said, his voice rumbling like shifting mountains. "His inner furnace is unstable." Lysera's claws had tightened against the stone floor. "Then stabilize it." A murmur had rippled among the gathered dragons. "We have given him fire from our own hearts," another elder had said. "We have infused him with warmth and strength, yet his flame falters." Lysera had felt the edge of panic creeping into her voice. "You are the oldest, you have seen plagues and storms, there must be something." "There is one possibility," Vareth had interrupted quietly. The cavern had grown colder. "Speak it," Lysera had demanded. Vareth's golden eyes had lifted to meet hers. "Humans." The word had hung like a crack in stone. For centuries, dragons and humans had existed in uneasy separation. There had been wars short and brutal. There had been hunts on both sides. Humans had feared dragons' fire, dragons had distrusted human ambition. Though open conflict had faded into myth, suspicion remained as old as bone. "They experiment," Vareth continued. "They study flesh and blood without relying on magic. They understand the small workings of life." Lysera's wings had twitched with disbelief. "You would have me bring my hatchling into human lands." "You would have him live," Vareth had replied gently. Silence had swallowed the chamber. Lysera had looked down at Arian's faintly glowing chest. Her pride, her fear, her centuries of inherited distrust, all of it had weighed heavily against a single truth. If she did nothing, he would die. "I will go," she had said. And so she had flown. Now, as dawn stretched pale fingers across the horizon, Lysera descended toward the human city of Aramith. She had never been this close before. From the air, the city resembled an intricate nest of stone and timber. Smoke rose from chimneys, fields lay carefully organized beyond the walls. Small shapes, humans moved along dirt paths like ants, purposeful and unaware. Her instincts screamed at her to stay away. Dragons did not ask. Dragons did not kneel. But Arian's breathing stuttered against her chest. She angled downward. The wind rushed past her ears as she folded her wings and dropped toward an open field beyond the outer farms. She landed with careful restraint, talons digging into frost-hardened soil. The impact sent a tremor through the ground, but she did not roar. She did not flare her wings. She lowered her head. Arian stirred weakly, releasing a faint, broken chirp. Lysera bent and nudged him gently. "We are here," she whispered. Then she began walking toward the city. Each step felt like walking into a trap. The first human to see her dropped his basket of grain and ran screaming toward the houses. Within moments, more voices rose. "The dragons! By the gods!" Doors slammed, windows shuttered. A bell began ringing from somewhere deeper in the settlement. Lysera's muscles tensed. She could turn back. She could fly away and die among her own kind, preserving dignity. Instead, she continued forward. She did not bare her teeth. She did not ignite her throat. She kept her wings folded tightly against her body, a deliberate sign of non-aggression. Her golden eyes scanned the buildings. She needed a healer, a human who dealt with sickness. Her gaze settled on a modest stone structure near the edge of the farmland. A carved wooden sign hung beside the door, marked with a symbol she recognized from distant observation, two hands clasped around a stylized flame. "Healing." She moved toward it. Inside the clinic, Dr. Elias Rowan was reorganizing a shelf of glass jars when the world outside erupted into chaos. He frowned, adjusting his spectacles. Then came the crash. Wood splintered, chickens squawked, something heavy shook the ground. Elias stepped outside and stopped breathing. A dragon stood at the edge of his yard. Not in a story. Not in a painting. In realities. She was enormous. Her emerald scales caught the morning light in muted brilliance. Scars traced faint lines along her flanks, signs of a life lived in wild skis. But it was her eyes that held him. They were not blazing with fury. They were desperate. Slowly she lowered her forelegs. And Elias saw the hatchling. He had expected terror to seize him. Instead, something else rose in his chest. Professional instinct. The baby dragon looked skeletal. The small chest rose unevenly. The faint glow beneath his scales flickered erratically. This was not an attacking beast. This was a mother carrying a dying child. Villagers began gathering at a distance, whispering frantically. Someone shouted to fetch the guard. Elias swallowed. Every tale he had ever heard about dragons warned him to run. But he had taken an oath in the capital years ago to treat the sick without prejudice. He stepped forward. The dragon's pupils narrowed, tracking him carefully. "Easy," he said softly, keeping his voice calm. "I'm not here to hurt him." The dragon did not move to strike. Instead, she lowered her head until it nearly touched the ground. Submission. A creature of immense power bowing. Elias' pulse pounded in his ears. He approached slowly, close enough to see the hatchling clearly. The baby's scales were dry and cracked near the edges. His breathing hitched. The glow in his chest sputtered unpredictably, bright one moment and dim the next. Elias had read scattered academic texts about dragon physiology during his studies. Most were speculation, myths mixed with observation. But one concept had appeared consistently. Heartfire was metabolic. A living furnace. If it destabilized, the dragon's entire system would collapse. Elias looked up at the mother. "You brought him to me." Her throat emitted a low rumble, not a threat but affirmation. Behind him, Captain Merck and a squad of guards rushed into view, spears raised. Dr. Merck shouted, "Get away from it." Elias did not turn. "He's dying," Elias replied steadily. "The dragon," Merck demanded. "The child." Silence followed. The words shifted the air. Lysera remained perfectly still, as if understanding the weight of what he said. Elias took a breath. "Bring him inside," he told her. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The dragon hesitated only a fraction of a second before stepping forward, moving with astonishing care. She avoided crushing the broken fence further. She folded her wings tightly. Inside the clinic, Elias quickly cleared the largest examination table, pushing aside tools and cloth. Slowly, he instructed, though he suspected she needed no guidance. Lysera placed Arian onto the reinforced wood as though setting down glass. Up close, the sight tightened Elia's throat. The hatchling's body was severely underweight, but that was not the only issue. The irregular heartfire glow suggested something deeper. Elias washed his hands briskly and began examining the tiny dragon. His stethoscope felt absurd against scaled hide, but he used it anyway, listening for rhythm irregularities. He gently palpated the abdomen. He checked the membranes beneath the eyelids. Temperature fluctuation. Weak muscular tone. Erratic internal heat outputs. This isn't simple starvation, he murmured. Lysera leaned closer, her massive shadow falling over the table. The heartfire is misfiring, Elias said slowly, thinking aloud. His body can't convert nutrients into stable energy. The dragon emitted a soft, anguished sound. Elias stepped back, mind racing. He recalled a research thesis from the Royal Medical Academy in the capital. An eccentric scholar who had theorized that dragon heartfire required trace minerals to function as catalytic agents. Iron, magnesium, sulfur compounds. If the drought had depleted prey animals of essential elements. If the deficiency had transferred through the food chain. Elias' breath caught. He's not just starving, Elias whispered, he's deficient. The dragon's eyes locked onto his. I might be able to help, he said carefully, but I need time and you must stay calm. Outside, tension escalated as more villagers gathered. Inside the clinic, however, something extraordinary had begun. A human physician stood over a dragon hatchling. And a dragon mother waited, not as conqueror, not as enemy, but as a parent clinging to hope. Elias moved toward his supply shelves, already calculating proportions in his mind. Behind him, Lysera watched every motion, every measured breath. The fate of her son now rested not in ancient flame, but in human hands. The furnace rekindled. The clinic smelled of crushed herbs, alcohol tinctures, and something new, something sharp and metallic. Fear. It clung to the wooden beams and glass jars, as surely as the dust from Lysera's wings now coated the stone floor. Outside, the murmur of villagers swelled into a restless tide. The bell in the watchtower continued its warning toll, though no flames rose and no buildings fell. Captain Merrick's soldiers formed a cautious perimeter around the clinic, spears lowered but not yet thrown. Inside, time narrowed to the rhythm of a dying hatchling's breath. Arian's chest rose shallowly. Fell, paused, rose again. Each pause lasted a fraction too long. Lysera stood near the back wall, her wings folded so tightly they trembled. Her tail lay curled along the floor, careful not to disturb a single table or chair. For a creature capable of reducing a city block to ash, she occupied the room with astonishing restraint. Her eyes never left her son. Elias moved quickly but deliberately. Panic would serve no one. He laid out glass vials, scales, mortar, and pestle. His hands were steady, years of battlefield medicine had forged that steadiness, but his mind raced through calculations and half-remembered theories. Iron deficiency alone would not destabilize heartfire this severely. Magnesium regulated combustion stability in controlled reactions. He had seen similar principles in alchemical experiments during his academy days. Sulfur compounds might aid ignition, but too much would overwhelm fragile tissue. He muttered to himself as he worked, aware that the dragon mother was listening. I'm going to attempt a catalytic supplement, he said clearly. It may cause a reaction, it may look frightening. Lysera's pupils narrowed. But if I do nothing, Elias continued, his flame will extinguish. A low, trembling rumble escaped her throat, not disagreement. Consent. Elias crushed the mineral blend into fine powder. He added distilled water, then a measured dose of glucose solution for immediate metabolic support. The mixture shimmered faintly under the lantern light, metallic flecks suspended in liquid. He glanced toward Arian. The hatchling's glow flickered again, bright, then dim, then barely visible. Elias swallowed. He had treated infants no larger than this. He had fought infections that threatened to steal breaths from tiny lungs. But this was unknown territory. He fashioned a narrow feeding tube from flexible medical tubing typically used for premature human newborns. He adapted its width carefully, trimming the edge to avoid scraping delicate scales. He approached the table. Lysera instinctively stepped forward. "Stay," Ilias said firmly. The dragon froze. Her claws flexed against stone, but she obeyed. Ilias placed one gentle hand along Arian's neck to stabilize him. The scales were warm, but unevenly so. Pockets of heat flared unpredictably beneath his skin. "Easy," Ilias murmured. He slid the tube carefully between small fangs, guiding it down the hatchling's throat with precise movements. Arian made a faint choking sound, then stilled. Ilias began administering the mixture slowly. Drop by drop. Outside, the soldiers tightened their formation. Inside, Lysera held her breath. The first few seconds passed without visible change. Then Arian's body jerked. The glow in his chest flared violently, bright enough to cast flickering shadows against the walls. The jars on the shelves rattled. Lysera roared not in rage but in raw terror. Ilias braced himself against the table. "It's a reaction," he shouted, "hold steady." The hatchling convulsed again. A thin line of smoke escaped his nostrils. Too much ignition at once. Ilias slowed the infusion immediately. "Come on," he whispered, "regulate, regulate." The glow surged brighter, then dimmed suddenly. Too suddenly. Lysera's massive head dipped toward the table, a broken sound rising from her throat. "No," Ilias breathed. He placed his hand directly over the hatchling's sternum, feeling for internal heat. It flickered weakly beneath his palm. He adjusted the dosage, slightly increasing magnesium concentration to stabilize combustion. Another dropped. Another. Arian's chest trembled. Then, a pulse. Not a flare. A pulse. Bright, warm, steady. The glow beneath his scales shifted from erratic white to rich gold. Arian inhaled sharply, a deep, shuddering breath that filled his tiny lungs fully for the first time in days. Then he cried. Not a weak whimper. A loud, indignant squeal that echoed through the clinic and silenced every voice outside. Ilias nearly sagged in relief. Lysera stared in disbelief. The glow continued pulsing rhythmically. Strong, stable, alive. Arian wriggled against the table, claws scraping faintly against wood. His tiny wings twitched. Ilias carefully removed the feeding tube. It worked, he whispered almost to himself. Lysera lowered her massive head slowly until her forehead touched the stone floor before him. The sound she made was low and resonant, not dominance. Gratitude. Outside, Captain Merck stepped cautiously into the doorway, expecting devastation. Instead, he saw a dragon bowing. And a human doctor standing between mother and child, unharmed. What happened? Merck asked quietly. Ilias exhaled shakily. We relit the furnace. The next hour was critical. Ilias monitored Arian's temperature closely. The hatchling's internal heat stabilized at a sustainable level. No more violent surges, no more dangerous dips. Lysera did not move from her place near the table. When Arian stirred and attempted to lift his head, she let out a soft chirr, a sound far gentler than anything the villagers had ever imagined dragons could produce. Ilias prepared a secondary diluted supplement. He'll need continued treatment, he explained. Small doses, gradual correction, his body must rebuild reserves. Lysera listened as if each word were carved into stone. Captain Merck lingered near the door. You're saying this wasn't an attack, Merck said slowly. She came here for help. Ilias nodded without looking up. She risked her life flying into a human city. That's not aggression, that's desperation. Merck glanced at the dragon. Lysera's eyes met his briefly, not hostile. Protective. He lowered his spear. Outside, the villagers' whispers shifted in tone. Fear had not vanished, but confusion had replaced certainty. Dragons did not beg. Dragons did not bow. Yet here one stood, waiting for instructions like any anxious parent. As evening fell, Ilias faced a decision. You cannot return to the cliffs yet, he told Lysera. He's too fragile, travel would strain him. Lysera's gaze flicked toward the darkening sky. She did not want to remain among humans. But she looked at Arian. Then back at Ilias. Slowly, she settled her body onto the clinic floor, curling partially around the table without touching it. She would stay. Night in Aramuth was rarely silent. But that night the silence felt watchful. Guards maintained their perimeter, torches flickered along the outer fields, no one dared approach too close. Inside the clinic, lantern light glowed warmly. Elias sat at his desk, recording detailed notes in a leather-bound journal. Subject, dragon hatchling, approximately 6 weeks post-hatching, he wrote. Severe metabolic destabilization due to mineral deficiency secondary to environmental collapse. He paused and glanced up. Arian was sleeping now, his tiny body rising and falling in steady rhythm. The golden glow beneath his scales pulsed softly, no longer chaotic. Lysera watched him with unwavering focus. You haven't slept, Elias observed quietly. Dragons did not answer in human words. But Lysera's gaze shifted toward him. There was something ancient in her eyes, something that had witnessed centuries of storms and wars. And yet, in this moment, she was simply a mother who had almost lost her child. You trusted me, Elias said softly. Lysera tilted her head slightly. Trust. The concept lingered between them. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters. Lysera's wings twitched instinctively, but she did not rise. Elias leaned back in his chair. He thought of the academy lectures, the dismissive tone scholars used when discussing dragons. Mythical creatures, unpredictable beasts, dangerous relics of a wilder age. They had never seen this. Never stood in a small clinic while a dragon bowed in gratitude. Near midnight, Arian stirred. He opened his eyes. They were brighter now, silver irises reflecting lantern light with curious clarity. He chirped softly. Lysera lowered her head instantly, touching her nose gently to his side. Arian nudged back weakly but with intent. Elias approached cautiously. Hungry, he murmured. The hatchling's gaze flicked toward him. There was no fear there. Only confusion and faint curiosity. Elias prepared a diluted nutrient mixture and offered it through a shallow dish. Arian sniffed it tentatively. Then, to Lysera's visible shock, he licked. A small spark flickered at the edge of his nostrils, controlled, not explosive. Elias smiled. That's more like it. Lysera exhaled slowly, tension easing from her frame for the first time since arriving. Outside, the guards shifted uneasily at the sight of smoke drifting faintly from the clinic chimney, but no alarm bell rang this time. Inside, something fragile and extraordinary had taken root. Understanding. By morning, word had spread beyond Aramuth's fields. A dragon had entered the city and not burned it. A human had treated dragonkind as patients rather than enemies. Merchants arriving at dawn slowed their carts, staring in disbelief at the massive emerald form visible through the clinic's windows. Captain Merck addressed the gathered villagers with measured calm. She has not attacked, he declared. The hatchling was ill, the doctor is treating him. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. An elderly woman stepped forward hesitantly. My grandson is sick, she said quietly. The dragon hasn't harmed anyone. Merck shook his head. No, fear did not vanish instantly. But it cracked. And through the crack, something unfamiliar entered. Perspective. Inside, Arian attempted to stand. His legs wobbled, but they held. Lysera made a low, encouraging sound. Elias observed carefully. The stabilization is holding, he said, but recovery will take days. Lysera's gaze remained fixed on her son. She had crossed ancient boundaries. She had placed her child's life in the hands of a species her kind had long distrusted. And the gamble had paid off. Arian took a small step. Then another. He stumbled and would have fallen if Lysera's claw had not hovered inches away, ready but restrained. Elias laughed softly. Careful there, little furnace. The hatchling blinked at him. For the first time, he let out a tiny, triumphant squeak. And in that small, defiant sound, something shifted not just in a clinic, but in the fragile history between flame and flesh. The day the sky changed. By the fifth sunrise, the bell in Aramuth's watchtower no longer rang at the sight of emerald scales. It rang for routine shifts, for trade caravans, for the rhythm of ordinary lives. And somehow, astonishingly, the presence of a dragon resting beside the town clinic had begun to fold itself into that rhythm. Lysera remained coiled partially around the outer wall of the stone building now. The interior had grown too cramped as Arian's strength returned. His small burst of flame had singed 2 ceiling beams already, and Elias had insisted on more space and fresh air. So they compromised. The clinic door remained open. Arian stayed within sight, and Lysera positioned herself like a living wall between the building and the wide fields beyond. Not threatening, simply present. The villagers still kept their distance, but distance was no longer frantic. Children peeked from behind fence posts instead of being dragged indoors. Farmers watched from fields rather than fleeing them. Fear had not vanished, but it had softened. Inside the clinic courtyard, Arian flapped his wings. The movement was clumsy, more enthusiasm than coordination, but he managed to lift himself a full handspan off the ground before landing in a tumble of silver limbs. He squeaked indignantly. Lysera lowered her head immediately, rumbling reassurance. Elias stood nearby with a notebook tucked beneath his arm. His muscle tone has improved dramatically, he observed. Heartfire output remains stable. He knelt, careful not to startle the hatchling. Let's see that glow. Arian puffed slightly at the request as if proud. The golden light beneath his sternum pulsed steady and warm, no longer erratic, no longer fading. Lysera watched Elias as he examined her son. There was no tension in her posture now, no coiled readiness to strike. Only attentiveness. Trust had not arrived all at once. It had been built in tiny increments, each successful feeding, each stabilized pulse, each quiet night without relapse. Trust, Elias reflected, was much like medicine. Precise, delicate, easily undone. Captain Merrick approached cautiously from the dirt path, helmet tucked beneath his arm. I've sent word to the capital, he said quietly to Elias. They'll want to know. Elias did not look up from Arian's. They will, he agreed. And when they comes. Lysera's eyes shifted toward the captain. Elias rose slowly. When they come, he said, we tell them the truth. Merrick studied the dragon for a long moment. Truth hasn't always prevented war. No, Elias admitted, but ignorance has caused most of it. Lysera's tail flicked once, not in agitation but acknowledgement. That afternoon, something happened that none of them expected. A young girl broke formation. Her name was Lysa, 8 years old, perpetually barefoot and braver than caution would advise. She had watched from a distance for days, clutching a wooden toy carved roughly into the shape of a dragon. Today, she stepped beyond her mother's grasp. Lysa, her mother hissed. But the girl kept walking. Toward Lysera. The guard stiffened instantly. Merrick's hand hovered near his sword. Lysera saw the child approaching. Her pupils narrowed, not in aggression but in focus. Arian noticed too. He tilted his head curiously. The girl stopped a safe distance away. Her hands trembled, but she did not run. Is he better? She asked Elias, her voice small but steady. Elias blinked, then smiled faintly. He is. The girl looked at Arian's. Then very slowly she held up the wooden toy. I made this, she said, so he wouldn't be lonely. A silence fell heavier than any battle cry. Lysera's gaze moved from the toy to the child. The scent of fear was faint, but so was the scent of hostility. Arian waddled forward impulsively. Lysera tensed, but Elias lifted a hand gently. Let's see what he does. Arian approached the girl in uneven steps. His silver wings twitched with excitement. The golden glow in his chest remained calm, steady. The girl crouched slightly and set the wooden dragon on the ground. Arian sniffed it, then nudged it. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he chirped happily and scooped it up between tiny claws. A collective breath released across the watching villagers. Lysera exhaled slowly. The girl smiled. He likes it, she whispered. Merrick lowered his hand from his sword. The sky did not burn. No firestorm descended. Only a small silver hatchling playing with a carved toy beneath the watchful eye of his mother. And that image would travel farther than any messenger. By evening, riders arrived from the capital. Their armor bore the insignia of the crown. Their expressions carried both urgency and suspicion. At their head rode Minister Havith, advisor on matters of defense and arcane threats. He dismounted slowly, studying Lysera with calculating eyes. So it's true, Haveth murmured. Lysera remained still. Arian sat beside Ilias, chewing thoughtfully on the wooden toy. Minister Haveth addressed Merk first. You allowed this creature to remain. She has harmed no one, Merk replied evenly. She sought medical aid. Haveth's gaze shifted to Ilias. You treated it. I treated him, Ilias corrected. He is a child. Haveth's jaw tightened. Dragons are not citizens. They are living beings, Ilias said calmly, and this one would have died without intervention. Haveth stepped closer, but not recklessly close. Lysera's eyes tracked him. You believe compassion will prevent them from turning on us? Haveth asked. Ilias met his gaze steadily. I believe understanding gives us better odds than fear. Haveth studied the hatchling. Arian sneezed suddenly, producing a tiny spark that fizzled harmlessly in the dirt. The soldiers behind Haveth flinched. Lysera did not move. Ilias knelt and gently adjusted Arian's posture. His heartfire was destabilized by mineral deficiency, Ilias explained. Environmental collapse reduced nutrient chains. The drought is affecting more than livestock. Haveth's brow furrowed slightly. You're suggesting their survival is linked to ours. It always has been, Ilias replied quietly. The wind shifted across the fields, carrying the scent of dry earth. Haveth looked around at the cracked farmland beyond the town. He had received reports of declining harvests, of rivers thinning. He had not considered dragons as fellow victims. Lysera rose slowly to her full height, not aggressively but unmistakably powerful. She stepped forward once. The soldiers stiffened. Then she lowered her massive head. Not to Ilias. To Haveth. A deliberate bow. Gasps rippled outward. Haveth froze. A dragon of her size bowing in acknowledgement before a representative of the human crown. It was not submission. It was recognition. Arian toddled forward and pressed himself against his mother's foreleg, peeking around it curiously at the armored strangers. Haveth stared at the hatchling, then at the human doctor standing protectively nearby. Remarkable, he murmured. Ilias seized the moment. This does not have to be the beginning of another war, he said quietly. It could be the beginning of cooperation. Haveth was silent for a long time. Finally he exhaled. We will not attack, he said, not today. It was not a treaty. But it was not violence. And sometimes that was enough. Days passed. Arian grew stronger. He began short flights across the open field, clumsy arcs that ended in dramatic landings and indignant chirps. His scales regained full luster, shimmering silver with hints of pale blue at the edges. Villagers adjusted. Farmers discovered that Lysera's presence deterred predators. Wolves no longer approached the outer fields. Bandits gave Aramith a wide berth after glimpsing emerald wings against the horizon. Trade caravans resumed their routes. And something unexpected emerged. Curiosity. Ilias began documenting dragon physiology in collaboration with Lysera's patient tolerance. He observed heartfire rhythms during rest and exertion. He studied scale regeneration and thermal regulation. Lysera, in turn, observed human agriculture. She noticed irrigation techniques, crop rotations, grain storage methods. On the 10th day, she took flight at dawn and returned by midday carrying something immense in her talons, a carcass of a mountain grazer far beyond the reach of human hunters. She dropped it gently outside the village. An offering, protein and mineral-rich meats. Ilias analyzed samples. High iron contents. Magnesium present in abundance. The drought hasn't hit the highlands as severely, he noted. Haveth, still stationed temporarily in Aramith, listened carefully. If dragons guided us to more stable hunting grounds, he mused, and we shared agricultural strategies. The thought remained unfinished. But it lingered. Lysera scratched a symbol into the earth that afternoon, a looping mark etched deep into soil. Ilias recognized it from ancient texts. Alliance. Partnership between fire and flesh. Haveth watched in silence. You understand her, he said quietly to Ilias. I listen, Elias replied. Arian fluttered clumsily toward Havith and stared up at the armored minister. The man hesitated, then slowly crouched. Arian reached out with one tiny claw and tapped the polished metal curiously. A faint spark jumped between scale and steel. Harmless. Havith exhaled a short laugh despite himself. You nearly burned my predecessor's army to ash, he muttered softly toward Lysera. She blinked slowly. The past remained, but so did the present. The morning Lysera chose to depart arrived clear and bright. Arian's heartfire was fully stabilized, his flight strength had tripled, his appetite was robust. He chased Lysa through the field once carefully, playfully, before tumbling into a heap of silver limbs. The girl laughed freely now. Lysera stood at the edge of the field, wings partially extended. Elias approached her. I've prepared mineral supplements, he said, holding up reinforced containers. Mix small amounts into prey until natural balances return. Lysera lowered her head so he could attach the containers securely to a harness improvised from treated leather and reinforced stitching. You'll need periodic reassessment, Elias added, if drought worsens. Lysera exhaled warm air against his shoulder. She understood. Havith stepped forward. If you return, he said slowly, you will not be met with spears. Lysera studied him. Then she extended one great claw and pressed it firmly into the soil before him. A mirrored symbol beside the earlier mark. Agreement. Arian scrambled up his mother's foreleg and perched awkwardly along her spine. He looked down at Elias and chirped, a sound that had once been weak and fatting, now vibrant and mischievous. Elias smiled. Try not to ignite anything important. Lysera spread her wings. The movement stirred dust and grass, but not fear. Villagers gathered not to drive her away, but to witness. The wind lifted beneath her wings. For a moment, sunlight caught her scales in brilliant green fire. Then she leapt. The downdraft rippled across the fields, flattening grass in a wide circle. Arian squealed in exhilaration as they climbed higher. Higher, until emerald and silver became silhouettes against blue sky. The people of Aramuth did not cheer. They did not shout. They watched, because they understood something had shifted. The sky no longer held only threat. It held connection. Elias stood long after the shapes vanished beyond the horizon. Merk approached quietly. Do you think they'll return? Elias considered the empty sky. Yes, he said softly, I think this is only the beginning. Behind them, in the dirt of the open field, two symbols remained carved deep into the earth. Flame, flesh, side by side. And though no treaty had yet been inked on parchment, something far more powerful had been written in memory. A dragon had carried her starving child across centuries of mistrust. A human had chosen compassion over fear. And in that choice, the sky itself had changed.